Hello, I'm Arik Korman, Communications Director at League of Education Voters, and the parent of a sixth grade son in the public school system who needs special education services. In case you're not familiar with us, League of Education Voters is a statewide nonprofit working with families, educators, and leaders to build a brighter future for every Washington student. Our website is educationvoters.org. We believe that education is a tool for justice. One of the systems that perpetrate racial injustice experienced by communities of color is our schools. We believe every child deserves an excellent public education that provides an equal opportunity for success. In order to achieve this, we must pursue radical change in our school systems for equity, justice, and liberation. We must build schools and systems that honor the humanity in every student. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series 7 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. Today's LEVinar features part 2 of a listening session with voices from the African American community. What works for African American students works for all students. In the wake of lives lost in the African American community, League of Education Voters has committed to listen, learn from, and amplify voices of the African American community because they are at the center of the movement for racial justice. In this webinar, we have assembled another statewide panel of African American thought leaders, community leaders, business owners, and educators to share their perspectives and answer your questions. Our panelists include Dr. Debra R Sullivan, educator, past president of the Seattle affiliate of the National Black Child Development Institute, BCDI Seattle, and author of Cultivating the Genius of Black Children. Dr. Marcus Pimpleton, Executive Director for Equity, Partnerships, and Student Engagement for the Yakima School District. Dr. Thelma Jackson, owner of Foresight Consulting, former college trustee, former multi-term school board member and chair, and has served on task forces and advisory councils for 5 governors of the state of Washington. And I promoted you, Sabrina Jackson Gandhi, national best-selling author, 25-year business owner, keynote speaker, founder of Seattle's Elevate Empowerment Movement, and former college trustee. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You'll notice a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This is a space for you to submit questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on the chat function or at info@educationvoters.org. All right, now some introductions. Dr. Debra R Sullivan is past president of the Seattle affiliate of the National Black Child Development Institute, where the primary focus of her work has been around implementing appropriate learning environments for Black children and working with families and communities to increase their advocacy for their children. The author of 3 books, Dr. Sullivan's 3rd book, Cultivating the Genius of Black Children, guides teachers in creating classrooms that support the learning needs of Black children and many other children with similar learning styles and preferences. One of Dr. Sullivan's favorite pastimes is cooking, and she owns at least 150 cookbooks representing a variety of countries, cooking techniques, and types of food. Give her some garlic, onions, and olive oil and prepare to feast. And Debra, I'd love to take you up on that one of these days. Dr. Sullivan earned her doctorate in educational leadership and her master's degree in curriculum and instruction, both from Seattle University, and a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology from the University of Washington. She was awarded an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree from Champlain College in Vermont. Dr. Marcus J. Pimpleton is an award-winning teacher and instructional leader committed to ensuring that all students receive an exemplary education that prepares them for success in college, career, community, and life. He presently serves as Executive Director of Equity, Partnerships, and Student Engagement for the Yakima School District. Prior to that, he served 2 years as principal of Quincy High School and as superintendent intern with the Quincy School District. As a co-facilitator of the Quincy School District's Access, Opportunity, and Equity Coalition, Dr. Pimpleton was instrumental in facilitating much of the racial equity professional development for the diverse coalition of stakeholders that wrote the Quincy School District's race and equity policy. The end result was board adoption of one of the strongest worded racial equity policies in the state, one that applies the University of Washington's Leadership for Learning, L4L, leadership standards to the unique context of Quincy. Dr. Pimpleton is the 2020 recipient of the Washington Association of School Administrators Howard M. Coble Scholarship, which honors underrepresented leaders preparing for central office roles. Additional honors he has received include a Washington State Golden Apple Award from KCTS and the Philip B. Swain Excellence in Teaching Award from the A+ Alliance for Education. During the summer months, Dr. Pimpleton continues to serve as director and program administrator for the Seattle Schools All-City Marching Band, and on Husky game days, an assistant director with the University of Washington Husky Athletic Bands. Dr. Thelma Jackson is owner of Foresight Consultants, bringing over 30 years of consulting experience in education change initiatives, restructuring and reform, equity and diversity, policymaking, school boardsmanship, cultural competency, community mobilization, strategic planning, educational auditing, school improvement, systemic change, curriculum evaluation for bias and fairness, professional development, and educational transformation. Dr. Jackson served on task forces and advisory councils for 5 governors of the state of Washington, including the Governor's Council on Education Reform and Funding in 1991, which resulted in the state's education reform law. Dr. Jackson served on the Advisory Council for the implementation of House Bill 2722, the legislation dealing with closing the achievement gap for African American students in the state. Dr. Jackson has served in numerous leadership capacities over the years, such as president of the Washington State School Directors Association. For 20 years was a member and 5-time president of the North Thurston School Board, served as president of the Pacific region of the National School Boards Association, as chair of the State Advisory Council on Vocational Education, as chairperson of the Washington State Legislative Ethics Board, as chair of the Commission on African American Affairs, and as president of the Board of Trustees of the Evergreen State College, where she later taught as an adjunct faculty in urban education on the Tacoma campus. Dr. Jackson currently serves on the steering committee of the Black Education Strategy Roundtable, and she was a hugely influential board member here at League of Education Voters. Sabrina Jackson Gandhi is a national best-selling author of Sacred Pampering Principles and All the Joy You Can Stand, international transformational speaker, business consultant, trainer, national seminar leader, strategic marketing coach, and self-care consultant. Ms. Gandhi has been featured in magazines and publications such as Oprah's O, Essence, Black Enterprise, Empowering Women, Women's Day, the Seattle Times, the New York Daily News, and the Atlanta Metro. In addition to being a popular guest on over 35 radio shows, she also guest hosts a radio show focusing on personal growth, spiritual development, and transformation. She has spoken for organizations and conferences nationally and internationally. She has appeared on TV on CNN, CNN Live, Good Day New York, Good Morning Texas, the Wisdom Channel, and numerous regional and local news stations. And she has shared the stage with greats such as Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, and Gladys Knight. Welcome, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Pimpleton, Dr. Jackson, and Sabrina Jackson Gandhi.
Woo, woo. All right.
Yeah, I am so honored to have you here.
The other panelists, my word.
Yeah, this is absolutely fantastic to have you here. I'm going to be asking 2 questions, which you're welcome to respond to. And please feel free to talk to each other when you are answering, because that's where the magic happens here. The questions will be, what is your personal take on what you're seeing, and also what you're hearing, what you're experiencing in and from your community, and about what's currently happening in this country? And the second question will be, based upon your experience, what works for successfully educating African American students? And Dr. Jackson, I'd like to start with you, just because you bring so much to the world. What is your personal take on what you're seeing and what you're hearing and what you're experiencing in and from your community about what's currently happening now?
Well, thank you, Arik. It's a delight to be a part of this very prestigious panel. and to think that my years of service in education equips me to be a part of this discussion today. When we talk about, what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, what I'm experiencing from my community and people that I interact with, it's a lot of trauma on top of trauma. Trauma at all levels, trauma as it relates to the children, the students, trauma as it relates to the parents and the families as they're trying to cope with everything that's going on. We talk in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we have a number of pandemics converging at once. And so we don't have the luxury of picking one at a time on which is going to traumatize us today. They're all coming at us so fast, so rapidly. And people are anxious. People don't know what they can look forward to the future for. People don't have any idea of how they're going to survive economically, how they're going to feed their families, how they're going to help in the education of their children, where it's assumed that they have the wherewithal to work from home and are there for and with their children. There's just an awful lot of uneasiness, and even to the point of fear. When you add the fear about what's happening in this country politically, and from the point of view of racial justice, this is not a good time for Black folk. We just seem to be getting it from every point of view. And when you bring it down to the children and our students, how do we protect them? How do we help them cope? Because we're struggling to cope ourselves, no matter how long we've been around, no matter what our experiences are. We're having a hard time reassuring each other, but we're hanging on, we're holding on. And one of my biggest concerns as I interact in my community is the amount of time our children, our students, not just K-12, but higher ed as well, in this distance learning mode, how much is really being missed? How much learning time are we losing out on when we do recover, when we do reestablish whatever the new norm is going to look like? How are we going to make up the lost time? And we're talking about the trauma, but it's at every professional level, our teachers, our administrators, our care providers. So we're just in a really troubling time, and it's very difficult to reassure people that everything's going to be all right, because I'm not so sure it will be.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jackson. And Dr. Pimpleton, you're on the other side of the state in Yakima. What are you hearing over there?
I think it's similar, I guess. I agree that it's a very difficult time for a lot of us, a lot of families, students, particularly our students of color who are so often at the bottom of things already. I also think, though, there is an opportunity that's presented in this, and that we are seeing our people do what our people do, which is figure it out in difficult times and step up. We're seeing the creative brilliance and the resilience of our communities, finding solutions, people working together. I was in a home where they had multiple families, kids there, all different grades, different corners of the house, figuring it out. And I think that we have an opportunity right now. These crises, and I agree that there's overlapping crises, all sorts of things that we're dealing with, not just COVID, but really just the reluctance of our leaders to really step into the moment and be leading for issues of equity and racial justice. But this moment has really revealed how feeble so many of our systems are, and the weaknesses in the ways that we normally operate. And so I think there is also a great opportunity for us to begin envisioning new ways of doing things and to address long-standing structural systemic problems in the way that we do the work of school, that we have an opportunity here in the midst of the crisis and in the midst of the tragedy. And there are a lot of leaders who are trying to forward that sort of a conversation. So at the same time that I'm troubled by what's going on, I'm also encouraged that we have an opportunity here to really figure out a better way forward. And there are a lot of folks who are really pushing us and encouraging us to do that work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Pimpleton. And Dr. Sullivan, I see that you're in a classroom right now, which seems so appropriate, and you have deep roots in the community. I'd love to hear your take on what's going on.
Well, thank you. First of all, I agree with what's already been said with Dr. Jackson and Dr. Pimpleton. There's a lot that's going on right now. And one of the things that I have heard repeatedly since last spring is, this is a wake-up call. And my thoughts on that is, the alarm's been going off for some time now, and as a country, we keep hitting snooze. So I don't think that this is just right now a wake-up call. Some of us have been listening to the snooze button get hit repeatedly over the decades. And so what I see is a lot of trauma, a lot of confusion. But at the same time, I think along with what Dr. Pimpleton was saying, that people are beginning to see the opportunities. It's kind of like, when you are forced to have to do something, when your basement floods, now you got to clear out the basement. You've been talking about it a long time, but now the water's there, the damage has been done. There's no ignoring it, pretending it didn't happen. How are we going to move forward, and to where do we want to move forward? So I'm seeing a lot of that. I am seeing that people are definitely trying. I think as a people, Black people don't give up, and that's one of the strengths that we carry through times like this, when we are literally having things come at us from all directions. But we don't give up, because if we were the give up type of people, we would not be here struggling today to make sure that we figure it out. I think when it comes to what's happening with education, I hold both sides, because I see both sides and I've heard both sides. One side is our children are losing out a lot. They practically lost out on all of last spring. And they are in this virtual learning environment where, as has been stated, a lot is being missed. On the other hand, they were missing out on a lot of that learning already because of their experiences in the classrooms already. So even when we think back to what is normal, or what was normal, our children were still getting overlooked and undereducated, and they were still getting their needs not met in many areas around the country. And so what we're seeing now is everybody else is also experiencing a lot of what Black children have been experiencing. And as of last spring and coming into the fall, I've heard more and more and more Black families and Black parents saying, well, wait a minute, I can do this. We are in this moment being reminded of what we have always been able to do. We have always had to educate our children, because our children were not allowed previously to be educated in white institutions. We have always educated our children. We have always created our own teachers, our own doctors, our own lawyers, our veterinarians. We have done this. And because we don't give up, we are now reminded that we have the opportunity, the chance, the wherewithal, the resources, the creativity, the brilliance to do it yet again.
Well said. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Sabrina, you have connections all around the country based on everything that you do. What have you heard lately? Because you had such great insights last month. What have you heard new about how things are going?
Well, I first just want to also say that I agree with everything the doctors have said. I am in high cotton today, and I love it. But I'm reminded of the opening statement of A Tale of Two Cities. And I mentioned this when I was on last time. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, all in one big ball. And much like I heard Dr. Pimpleton say and Dr. Sullivan say, this to me has been a time of revelation, revealing what's already been going on. And it's been a Wizard of Oz moment, which means it's a time of reckoning. There are so many systems that have not been working for so many people for so long, but the American approach is often one of avoidance or create a task force. And so now we are seeing deterioration, disintegration, breakdown. And that's the worst of times part, but the best of times part goes back to what Dr. Pimpleton also said, because now we get to say, well, what will be the new phoenix that arises out of that? Instead of waiting to see what the new norm is, how about we declare what our new norm is? Because our country was reeling out of control. The speed of life was killing parents, it was killing kids in terms of our spirit, giving us all kinds of ailments and mental issues and addictions and neuroses. So we were like to me, like a freight train headed downhill with no brakes. Little did we know this is what it would take to slow the train down before it went off the tracks and killed everybody on the train. And so, so that's how I'm viewing this time. And even for myself, as a time of metamorphosis and rebirth in this season. One of the, it's not necessarily new, but you asked kind of about the pulse nationally. And what I'm hearing, especially from folks who have school-aged children, is how incredibly stressful it has been for them to do this remote learning because of the lack of clarity. The technology pieces aren't congruent and consistent and easy to access, even finding out where homework is and what platforms are being used. I mentioned last time, one of my colleagues who lives in the Washington, D.C. area, her husband was working from home, she was working from home, and her kids were now being schooled from home, and they had to upgrade their Wi-Fi. So now they're outlaying more money so they can accommodate the bandwidth that the Wi-Fi needs to be, so well, what if you don't have Wi-Fi in the first place? What if you don't have money to upgrade? What if you have your own business and you're a single parent? How can you be sitting there with your child going through classes if y'all's livelihood depends on your ability to keep running your business? And so that's definitely an especially stressed out group. And then once students went back to classrooms, that was stressful too. So on one hand, it provided some relief, but it created another kind of stress because now you don't know what kind of measures and precautions all the other kids they're exposed to have been experiencing or not. And so if you were to, catch something from that exposure every day and you're the sole breadwinner, that creates a whole other set of issues. So there's all that. And then, I would also mention that, many churches still are not convening live. And the Black church has been the institution that has saved us and kept us sane and connected in this country. And it has been the institution that we've authored, that we've grown, that's ours. So to not be able to convene in churches and the spiritual connection, the emotional support, the prayer support, the touch, the hugging, the how are you doing, that helped us make it through another week, and we could relieve ourselves of some anxiety or emotion through the praise and worship, through the message, through the community and the interchange and exchange. That is gone for a lot of us. So that gone, combined with all the other things that we've already talked about, creates an extra stressor without the infrastructure to support. And last but not least is, I think about if if our president was a different human being who had a heart that worked, and how this would be much easier if there was just basic demonstrations of compassion, basic demonstrations of decency, basic demonstrations of awareness outside of self, of an experience that's not based upon yours as the only experience. That would make it so much easier. But instead of us having solace, we get stressed when we hear a broadcast from the president. It didn't have to be that way, but it is. So you take all those things I mentioned, and then where there could be something that causes you to exhale a little bit, you watch our national leader, the head of the country, and you get more stressed because of the ignorance, insensitivity, and some other things. So that's kind of the worst of times part of it. But, you know, like I said, I also see the beauty. For me personally, I've been outside more days to get fresh, real air in these last 7 months than I have in the previous 7 years. And so I'll take all wins. And as I talk to other people around the country, those kinds of things, wellness, upgrading their wellness, having time to now get in more movement, cleaning out houses and homes and new projects. And so it's kind of an amalgam of all those, all thrown in there together. It's quite a beautiful hodgepodge.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sabrina. We'll get to your questions soon, by the way. And if you do have questions for the panel, you can type them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to move to our second question for the panel, which is, based upon your experience, what works for successfully educating African-American students? And Dr. Pimpleton, I'd like to start with you, just because you are right there in the middle of the Yakima School District, and I'm sure you have a lot of communications with educators and students and families to find out what's working.
Yeah, I think that successful education of kids, you know, boils down really to, you know, the same three things that we've always recognized it boils down to: relationships, relevance, and rigor. And I think starting with the relationships piece is really vitally important. And we come up with these very complicated formulas to try to coach people into loving kids, but basically it starts with loving kids and caring about what happens with them as an outcome. And when you love kids and you are concerned about their outcomes, then they recognize that and they make a connection with you, and they'll go where you need them to go and learn what you need them to learn. I think that the relationships piece also has to extend beyond between the educator and the student, but it also needs to be a strong relationship connection to the content. You have to make the material that we're asking for the young people to learn, it has to be something that they can see themselves in. It has to be relevant to them. That's that relevance piece, is that they're invested in it because they either see some value in it happening for them right now, or they see the value of it happening for them in their future. So how do we really make sure that beyond, you know, in addition to I'm here for you, we love and care for you, make the content meaningful. And this time is requiring us to really figure out what is really at the core of what we want students to learn and know and be able to do. Because we can't just teach everything, right? We have to know, we have to focus on some key things. And so what is it? What is it that's really of value, and how do we make that value key to them? And then rigor, right? Like wherever you're at, that you're challenged at an appropriate level, right? So that you are being pushed to take whatever that next step is. The teacher is the one who knows the little bit more than you to get you to take that next step. I've seen kids learn from other kids more than they learn from the adult who's there to guide their learning, because they have relationships, that person is pushing them, and what's going on is relevant. So I think those are really the three key pieces. And then we need to be aware of what's the impact of what we're doing. Like we're checking in for results that we're seeing, like, is it happening or is it not happening? Where do we fall short? What do we have to do different the next time? Who's on, who's not? But I think those are really the critical pieces in order for students to have successful learning. And I think I want to go back to one of the things that Miss Jackson Gandhi was saying, which had to do with kind of the political climate. It's like we are dealing with the politicization of things that should not be political, right? So wearing a mask should not be a political statement, right? Whether we care about the social and emotional wellness of students and teachers and make sure that if we're asking people to be in school buildings, that we're doing that in a way that they feel safe and supported, that should not be a political thing. And this idea of racial equity, I'm in a school district where they're very much on the very beginning levels of having these conversations around race. There's a lot of apprehension and reluctance to discuss race when our political leadership are making the very topic of racial equity and disparities that we can obviously see, when that's being politicized and it's becoming a un-American conspiracy or something to even just discuss and acknowledge things that we can all see. It complicates a problem that really should not be politicized in these ways. And so I think that when we really start with that relationships piece of just caring about one another and where one another are and wanting to understand and know the experiences of one another, having that basic ability to empathize, like to meet you in your situation and to understand that situation, that is really the beginning of it all. And I have spent the last 2 weeks meeting with kids in classrooms to ask them how things are going. And we have some amazing young people who are incredibly resilient and empathetic and care. Like the kids are talking about, worried about how their teachers are feeling, not having kids in the classroom and the experiences of them. And the kids too are being, this moment is also revealing that kids are needing us to meet them where they are on an individual level and differentiate. There are some kids who I didn't expect to be excelling in a virtual learning environment because we expect those kids to have, we expect it to be predictable who's going to struggle, who's not. Some kids have been embracing and rising to the challenge, and some kids who you expected to be successful in the environment are having struggles. Kids are, the remote learning nature has required teachers to use tools that they hadn't used before, and we're finding that technology actually helps. And so I've been asking kids, what should we keep when we come back from this time? And they've talked about some of the tools and resources. So I think that it all really does though begin with just relationships, that you love kids, that you make sure that there's a solid connection between you and them and between them and the content, and that you are meeting each one where they're at and finding the solutions that each individual students need.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Pimpleton. Dr. Sullivan, you wrote a book called Cultivating the Genius of Black Children. How do you do that?
Well, first of all, you have to care deeply about children, but you have to realize that you need to care deeply about other people's children. It's one thing to say, I love children, but when you are teaching, you need to care about the future, the well-being, the education of other people's children, which means that you also need those relationships with their families and with their communities. You need to know who those other people are. Children don't come into your classroom absent of any adult grown-up influence. When they come into the classroom, they bring their grown-ups with them. And so in order to cultivate the genius of Black children, you have to first understand that there's genius there. You have to understand that there's genius to be found in every single human being. Someone once asked a third grader, I love to tell this story. Someone once asked a third grader if he knew the difference between gifted education and special education. And he said, oh yeah, that's easy. He said, everybody knows that. He goes, in the gifted classroom, they find out what you're really good at, and you do that all day long. And in the special ed classroom, they find out what you're really bad at, and you do that all day long. So if you want to cultivate genius, you have to understand that every single human being, past, present, and future, comes with both gifts and challenges. And that if we're not focusing on both of those things, we're doing both groups a disservice. You cultivate genius by providing opportunities for children, Black children in particular, to thrive and to grow, to be creative. When you provide learning environments in which they can showcase their gifts and talents, and also where they can understand what their challenges are and then go about seeing how you address those. And sometimes that is addressed, as Dr. Pimpleton said, by their interaction with other children. You cultivate genius by not going into a classroom and playing teacher. And unfortunately, too many of us females played teacher when we were young, and we got our little pointy thing and lined up our dolls and stuffed animals, and we had their undivided, silent, still attention for hours. Those aren't kids, and you can't do that in a classroom. So cultivating genius is allowing that genius to be present, is allowing a child to show you what they are really good at. And then you take what they're really good at and use that as the foundation for building up where their challenges are. I don't know any grown-up who wants their supervisor or their boss to come and stand next to their desk day after day after day, telling them what they're doing wrong and writing their name on a board and putting check marks when they didn't get something right so that they can't go to lunch break recess. We don't do those things to each other. So we need to think about, how do you get genius adults? By cultivating that genius in children.
Yeah, I love that.
Well, I'm going to jump in next so that Dr. J has the final word of this LEVinar series. And I'm a non-educator. I've been in the policy world, but I have not been in the classroom world. But there are some very clear and distinct things that I see work and support the activation of that Black genius that Dr. Debra talked about. So I tend to focus more on context, while the conversations I hear about a lot of from educators often focus on content. So context is really important. So Dr. Pimpleton talked about loving children and loving Black children, which is a challenge. A lot of our teachers are Caucasian females. And if you grew up in these United States, you have not been detoxed of the sickness of racism and false white supremacy. So you're coming in with that, infecting and affecting how you think, see, perceive, engage, relate. So that's a tall order, to be detoxed from something that's so insidious from a very young age in this country. But you got to love Black kids, and they have to know it, and they have to feel it. So how do you have them know it and feel it? Acknowledgement. So for example, I do a lot on Zoom now, which I never did before. And I often have 95% of my participants are African-American. I take the time when I come on as the facilitator, the coach, to say everybody's name on the screen, all 35 people, all 40. And as soon as I say their name, acknowledging that I see you, acknowledging that it matters that you're here. I don't care if it takes 6 extra minutes. Connection, I care. How do they know I care? I said your name. I see you. I call your name. I say, good to see you. So those kind of things we can think are incidental, not for Black children. I see you. I get your name pronounced correctly. I might even touch you on the shoulder so I make connection with you. And, you know, I think about Marva Collins, the great Black educator from Chicago, who didn't have resources, but because of her love and because she knew, believed, and understood the genius of Black kids, she was teaching them things that were 5 and 6 years ahead of the public school system. So also, you know, last call, Rashad Norris talked about energy-based education. Because of this biochemical ingredient in our bodies as Black people called melanin, we process energy very differently. And so much of the post-agrarian classroom is about sit still, be still, sit here, look forward, which is the complete contradiction to we tend to like to be in movement. We're polyrhythmic. So allowing more movement. Your child might not have to just sit there and look at the screen and say, Hey, Derek, if you need to stand up as we do the lesson, or be doing some stretching or whatever as you listen, allowing more movement, not so much of this contained context. The last thing I'll mention is Highline College, where I used to be on the board of trustees. There was a program that they went to California to research and bring back to the Highline campus that was specifically targeting African-American college students. It was called Emoja. And it was a program that had the pedagogy that worked for African-American students. So instead of them having all these classes, they had one class called the Village. All the instructors came to the Village. They had one consistent counselor that they called Mama Elizabeth. And she was not only their teacher, but she also had emotional support and spiritual support. She was a constant. And what they found is that the persistence of African-American students that used to be a challenge with them completing, getting their certificate, it skyrocketed. Not because the content changed, but because the context changed. And it was aligned with what works for how they think, move, interact, relate, and process data. And the grade levels went up, the persistent numbers went through the roof. And we were the first college 4 or 2 year to bring the Emoja program to the state. So I have seen the difference that when we get the context, it makes a world of difference. Thank you.
And thank you, Sabrina. And finally, Dr. Jackson, go ahead and bring us home. Based on your experience, what works for successfully educating African-American students?
Well, this has been an awesome conversation, and I'm just delighted to share this panel with my other 3 colleagues. We talk about the relationships, the relevance, the rigor, but one thing that I think is so very important is the whole belief system of high expectations. And when we talk about, you know, what leads to success for African-American children in their learning, it's incredible. It's incredible how incestuous is this whole low expectations that our children have to put up with. And what everyone is talking about, Dr. Pimpleton, Dr. Sullivan, Sabrina, we're talking about cultural relevance. This is what's going to make the difference in the experience of our children. I was talking earlier about the challenges and the trauma and the depression and the fear. But out of it all, and my other 3 colleagues mentioned it in so many words, but necessity is the mother of invention. And until the need was there, until it became necessary, we didn't invent or look to anything differently. So Deborah talks about, you know, the water in the basement, and you've been putting it off, but now that it's flooding, you got to deal with it. So for Black parents and the Black community, where we've had to put up with this a monopolistic system of public education, now that's gone away. And so the necessity is there to still provide the education our children need. And out of that necessity is the acknowledgement that cultural relevance is at the root of it all. The relationships, the need for rigor. We've always been in a rigorous kind of expectation mode until we acquiesced over to the public school system. We go back to that. And we talk about, Deborah talks about finding the giftedness in all of our children. We've known all along that our children, that children's learning style is much more adaptive to the technology that's now needed in the distance learning that's going on. So I have no doubt that given the proper tools and equipment, that they're in another zone as far as succeeding. And it's not the monotonous reading and writing and rote memory. And so we're in a technology age where most of our Black children have not been left behind from that, but their learning ability in that zone has not been acknowledged by the school system. So if we could just equip them with what they need, we're going to be seeing the next Nobel Prize programmers and all of this kind of thing. But out of the necessity to make sure that our children are learning and learning at high levels, and we're holding them to high expectations, that necessity is going to cause us to come through this very traumatized period we're living in with all of the convergence that's happening on us. And the brilliance of the children is going to help settle us freaked out adults who struggle to manage all this. But the cultural relevance is the term I would coin that embraces all of what the other three and what me myself was talking about. That is what's going to ensure successful education of African American students. They've not had a culturally relevant curriculum. They've not had culturally responsive instructional materials. They've not had culturally competent teachers. The implicit biases, the institutional racism that they have to navigate on a daily basis. There's so much about that that's now been unearthed, exposed, as Sabrina said, as the others have said, and now it's out there. The American education system can stop denying that it's racist.
Yeah.
It stopped denying that it has truly been about adequately educating Black children and other disenfranchised, marginalized children in our system. So it's out there now. It's fully exposed. So how do we retake and repossess the need to educate our own? Because the only way we got educated, as Dr. Sullivan said, is that we had to do it ourselves. The whole historical Black college and university system came up through that whole process. They won't let us their schools, so we'll set up our own. And the excellence that's come out of those institutions, we've proven we can do it. We've proven we can do it. And so out of this necessity, we're going to invent and reinvent these ways to make sure that African-American students are not as left behind as they've been left before. And as parents just rediscover that they truly are their child's first teachers.
Yes.
Truly are their.
Ashe.
And so we have a lot to benefit from this convergence of pandemics that we are trying to deal with. But out of it is going to come a lot of good, a restoration of hope, and some new systems that never would have been had we continued along the lines we were going, because we know they were not working. So that's what's going to be success. That's what's going to be needed for African-American students to be successful going forward.
Dr. Jackson mentioned this word of belief, and while Dr. Debra was talking, I was thinking about that word belief as well. And it's just such a powerful idea that you will never do what needs to be done to cultivate a genius that you don't believe is there. And the other part is that it's very easy to profess a belief and to profess a love, but what does it really look like in practice?
Yeah.
And where can we recognize that if our behavior and our conduct and our practice is not in alignment with what we say we believe, we have to be willing to re-question, do we really believe that? And we have to be willing to really go back and unlearn some things, because I talk to a lot of teachers who say they believe that every student is a genius, every student is gifted. Well, if you believe everyone's gifted, then why do you have gifted segregated from everyone else? Like, it doesn't line up with your belief to say that you have to create a special program for gifted students if you believe that all students are gifted, right? Like, if you have to figure out some assessment, if you have to, we just have to get to a place to where we figure out, like, if we really believe that everyone is capable of achieving on high levels and that everyone is gifted and everyone is talented, when our results are not lined up with our belief, then we have to look back at ourselves and say, what do we have to do differently to get the result? If I know that that seed is supposed to grow into an oak tree and it's not popping up as an oak tree, I got to figure out on what is it that I have to do to create the conditions where oak trees grow. because it's obviously got to be me. But we give ourselves a pass so often because our belief in the inherent brilliance of every child, and especially our Black children and our brown children, we give ourselves a pass because so many of us don't really believe what it is that we're saying. And so we have to,
That's good.
hold up the mirror. And a big part of the work of the people of color and a lot of women of color who are leading this equity work in school systems and in districts, they're trying to hold up a mirror to these systems. And it's incredibly draining work because when people look in a mirror and see themselves, they have a negative reaction to what it is that they're seeing a lot of the times, and it can be very difficult. And so I guess one thing I would want to enter is just the importance of making sure that you have that community to reconnect with. She was talking about church being a source of that, but making sure that you have that when you're not able to go to the church meeting space, that it's very important that we stay connected to something that can, you know, replenish us and root us, because it's a very hard to lead for this sort of work, especially in these times and when it's causing people to look and see things about themselves that they may not necessarily be ready to face.
Mhm.
Woo.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Pimpleton, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Sullivan, and Sabrina Jackson Gandhi. We have about 7 minutes for questions. And for you who are listening, you can type your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And no question is too basic. And the first one is for Dr. Sullivan. This should be an easy one. Where can people find your book, Cultivating the Genius of Black Children?
You can find it 2 places. Red Leaf Press is my publisher. So if you go to Red Leaf Press, you'll be able to find it. Some people have been able to find it on Amazon, but often Amazon doesn't have it. But Red Leaf Press will have the book.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so here's a broader question. How can we mobilize our teachers and staff to implement the history of Black contributions as part of American history?
You know, I'd like to jump in on that one because I talk to a lot of teachers. You know, my first degree was in cultural anthropology, so I'm constantly talking about culture in a variety of different ways. And I think the first thing is our teachers, all of our teachers need to just sit back, take a deep breath, and acknowledge that they weren't taught Black history. And you can't teach what you don't know. And our schools still aren't teaching it. So sometimes I hear teachers get a little defensive about teaching Black history, or how do I learn about Black history? You just have to do as those of us who are multi-generational people of African descent in this country, you got to go find it. That, you know, all of us who grew up in the United States of America spent 13 years, kindergarten through 12th grade, learning about the experiences of Europeans in the United States. We have not spent 13 years learning about any other group. So the first thing that has to happen is you have to take an initial internal self-motivated step towards learning more about Black people and their history, not just in this country, but their history worldwide. Black people have been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and we tend to focus on, you know, like the last 400 in this country anyways. And so take a step, learn some more, read Black literature, explore Black art. You can Google, you know, famous Black people in history. You can learn an awful lot. Learn about Black people, learn about Black culture, learn about Black cultural capital. Just increase your cultural intelligence around Black people.
Yeah, we have a follow-up question, which is along the same lines. With all the standardized curriculums out there that teachers are directed to use and don't have autonomy to change, do you have suggestions or specific curriculum ideas?
Let me speak to that. Just because there are standards that's expected, those standards don't dictate what medium you arrive at those outcomes. So you need to be able to read, write, think, so what you read is in the teacher's domain. What you write about can be that assignment. And so there are different ways to achieve those state level expectations. And that's been an excuse for far too long.
One quick thing I wanted to add to that first question is that I think, first of all, it's reframing our thinking. It's not Black history, it's accurate American history. It's accurate American history, because we are so inextricably intertwined and uniquely intertwined between African Americans and European Americans in this country, unlike any other two people groups. So it isn't just, oh, we need everybody's history. Hold up, we just want accurate American history, first of all. And just as a place to start, if teachers are looking for, like, how can I educate myself, the 1619 Project, award-winning journalistic effort supported by the New York Times Magazine, and the response blew them out of the water. They had to go back to reprint 15 times. They have educational resources for classrooms. So have a commitment to teaching accurate American history, not Black history.
And that's uneducated talking.
Oh yeah, the non-educated.
I would add to that is, I saw something the other day where Mattel had created a Barbie and then the Black Barbie, and they're talking about race together. And I thought that's a nice step, but really we have real access to real Black people in the day-to-day that people can talk to. You don't have to go to a book to learn about Black people. There are real Black people for white people to interact with. And so I would say have actual relationships with people who are different than you. Be open to their perspective and share and have dialogue. And that is a very important first step as well. Have some curiosity about the people that you're around all the time and their experience, and don't just dismiss it.
That's right.
Well said. Well said. Unfortunately, we are just flat ran out of time. And I've got to thank you, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Pimpleton, Dr. Jackson, and Sabrina for joining us today. And thanks to everyone who participated in the chat and submitted questions. We got a lot more questions we couldn't get to. Panelists, would it be okay if I share your contact information in the follow-up email?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, great. Thank you so much. Our next LEVinar brings together a statewide panel of students who will share how they're doing during these challenging times and the supports that they need most. We expect to confirm a date by the end of the week, and you can find registration information by visiting our website, educationvoters.org, clicking on events, and then lunchtime LEVinars. I'll share the LEVinar information on our Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn social media channels, and in an email to everyone on our listserv. If you're not on our mailing list already, you can go to educationvoters.org/subscribe. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. If you have additional questions or comments, please send them to Arik, A-R-I-K, @educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation with closed caption capability will be available on our website, educationvoters.org, and will be sent to you in the follow-up email. And you're welcome to share that recording with your friends and colleagues. If you'd like to learn more about League of Education Voters or support our work, please visit our website, educationvoters.org. Thank you again for attending. Each one of us has the right to feel safe and valued. Together, we will fight for a world in which true educational and economic equity exists. We look forward to seeing you in future LEVinars. Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Pimpleton, Dr. Jackson, and Sabrina Jackson Gandhi, thank you for everything you brought today, and thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you, Lev, for doing this. Thanks, Arik.
Yes.
You're the
Thank
best.
you.